Hello, everyone, and welcome to this speaker event from the Translational Data Analytics Institute. My name is Srini Parthasarathy. I'm a professor in computer science and engineering at Ohio State, and I'm also a co-lead of the Responsible Data Science Community of Practice under the aegis of the Translational Data Analytics Institute. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. We welcome to the speaker series Professor Monica Sanders. She is an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware. She teaches law, policy, and society and a class on long-term disaster recovery. Her research interests include technology and vulnerable groups and legal constructs for just recovery. Previously, she has taught courses of a similar nature at Washington and Lee University and also has an appointment, faculty affiliation at the Georgetown University Law School. She has previously served as a senior legal advisor for international response and programs at the American Red Cross, focusing on international disaster response and humanitarian assistance principles. Previously, Professor Sanders was a senior committee counsel for both the House of Representatives and the Senate Committees on Homeland Security. She has also served on a number of advisory boards, including ones for the Institute for Building Technology and Safety, as well as FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And she works closely with FEMA on issues related to equity and vulnerability, especially as they relate to disasters and climate change. Professor Sanders received her degrees from the University of Miami, Catholic University of America, the Harvard Law School Project on Negotiation, and University College in London. It is a distinct pleasure and honor to welcome her today. And Monica, if you could, please share your slides. And again, thank you very much for being able to give this presentation and talk about AI disaster policy that you're going to be going over right now. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you all so much for having me. I'm excited to get to talk about this topic, particularly in the frame of the work that you're doing at the Translational Data Institute and within the working group. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to do today, my topic is about big data, artificial intelligence, disasters, and misrepresentation and undercounting. What we're seeing now as we increasingly engage in all of these different technologies is how to make them the most useful for the most people is the big existential question that we have to ask. But when we're asking it in the context of disasters, it's important to take into account vulnerability, connectedness, data literacy, accessibility. Because what we've learned about disasters is if you have any intersection of vulnerability, a large catastrophic event will make it worse. We're living in this kind of event right now as we're talking about the global pandemic and disproportionate impacts. So when we come to a place of convergence between how do we use technology to address disaster issues and how do we deal with vulnerable and marginalized groups, we have to take into account all of those uses and all of the challenges that come with it. So what I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of background on the evolution of the use of different kinds of technologies in disaster response and recovery. We're going to talk about vulnerable groups and mistrust in institutions and how that plays a role in how and whether we can use this with some people. And then we'll talk about specifics about collection, about representation. And of course, whenever we discuss societal problems, we also want to offer up some solutions for debate. So I'm hoping that we can get into all of this today. I'm looking forward to your questions. Feel free as I go along to put them in chat and we'll get a head start on answering them as we go along. But with that said, I am going to share my screen and we will start to look at what all of this means. All right. So here's what we are looking at today. So 2005, Hurricane Katrina is widely known as the event that taught us two things about hurricanes. One is that for those of us who have been tracking climate change, that's our first evidence that storms would be more climate driven. They would take up more space. They would have more detrimental impacts. We would see superstorms like we would Sandy a few years later. That was our first real acknowledgement of a climate driven disaster. The other thing that came from Katrina was a true acknowledgement of social vulnerability. The laws that were passed post Katrina dealt specifically with poverty, specifically with people with disabilities, language access issues, and it uncovered the disparities in race and gender in this society. The other thing about Katrina was Facebook was only a year old at that point. It was a social media platform, and most of it was about pokes and gaming and staying connected. It was designed for college students, and mostly college students and people affiliated with college students were what were using Facebook at that time. Never would we have imagined that social media would play the role in understanding disasters that it does today. Also, at that time, we understood the lived experiences of different groups of people through the lens of academic studies, traditional media, right? Because then CNN played a very heavy role in helping us to understand how people live. We weren't doing a lot of live streaming. We weren't taking a lot of our context and our evidence from social media and alternative media at that time. Now compare that with today. In 2020 and COVID-19, we're using crowdsourcing, we're using satellite data, we're using mobility data, browser data, mapping, drone footage, citizen science via social media platforms. We learn a lot about what people are doing and how they experience from Instagram lives and Twitter feeds. So what happened in between? Hurricane Sandy was actually considered, just as Katrina was a breakthrough year for understanding climate-driven disasters and social vulnerability, Sandy was a breakthrough year in many people's minds and in many studies for using data to understand disaster response and recovery and to understand what people were experiencing. By the time Sandy had come along, the city of New York was already reaching 3 million people just with its website and its social media presence. FEMA had just begun it, and it was at the 6 million person point. That also brought with it a new era of using mapping and predictive data and predictive modeling to understand flooding and storms. However, the other thing that Sandy brought to bear again, but in a different way, was the disparities between low and high income neighborhoods and the racial and ethnic disparities in our country. So some of the things that we learned in Katrina were revisited during Sandy. This is where institutional mistrust comes into play. In Sandy, you already had quite a long track record of law enforcement using technology to track people for law enforcement purposes. And we know about the studies and disparities and how the uses with respect to some law enforcement agencies wrongfully identify people. It's focused mainly on Black and Latin communities, although other communities are impacted. That's one of the largest areas of where we see mistrust in institutions and institutional use of what we term big data. There's been a lot of bad press with respect to the institutions that we identify within the technology industry. And unfortunately, while those of us who are attending here know that the internet with a capital I and technology with a capital T has many different stakeholders, in public discourse, we associate that with Silicon Valley companies. We associate it with social media. We associate it with multi-level platforms like Google. And so when Google has an issue with race and representation, unfortunately, it takes over the public dialogue for all of us who exist under this big hat of internet and technology, and brings the entire diverse expressions and stakeholders who are working in this space under the lens of questioning about representation, about racial bias, about gender bias. The predominant issue around this is historic over surveillance and marginalized communities for law enforcement and unfortunately for health and academic research purposes without really getting the benefit. Now that that ability is enhanced with other types of technology, and we haven't addressed those historical mistrust issues, what we're seeing is an exacerbation of it. So some examples are the New York City Police Department has all of the technologies I just mentioned, closed circuit cameras, drones, mapping, mobility data, facial recognition, AI driven databases, but still we hear stories about people being misidentified and arrested for crimes that they didn't commit, and also seeking redress in the courts for those issues. But when it comes to using AI driven programs to think about things like housing benefits or agency recovery benefits, those same communities are undercounted. And there are probably as many, if I told you a type of collection or a type of use, I could point out a marginalized group that has an issue with it. But we're going to cover some of the big ones right now. When we talk about harvesting social media and browser data, we're often using the same tools and collection methods that are done by an individual with an implicit bias or a lack of exposure. So when we talk about algorithmic bias generally, what we're talking about is the fact that an algorithm, for purposes of a general audience, is just a very complicated equation. And the inputs into the equation are reflective of the person who's doing the writing. So if you lack diversity in your data science community, you're going to lack diversity in all of the expressions that come from that community. So what happens when we have the conversation about algorithmic bias is you get odd outcomes like facial recognition technology that's done in certain companies or in certain population pools may not be able to appropriately recognize people with darker skin. So you get misrepresentation and wrongful arrests and undercounting and that kind of thing. When you're talking about social media harvesting, we're talking about going to Facebook, which has issues of representation of different political views, as we're hearing in the public discourse, as well as some of the public hearings going on with that particular platform, as well as race issues. The same thing could be said of Twitter or TikTok. You're getting populations at a certain income level from certain demographics and probably proven or not proven certain political expressions. So when your data sets are coming from that particular source, you're going to incorporate the same biases and the same problems into whatever you're building from that source. Another example that Stanford and Carnegie Mellon did, older people, a lot of this having to do with facial contours and some of the discrete issues of how the machine is being trained, are less likely to be captured in COVID-19 mobility data. The same for non-white Americans, per what I was saying about difficulties detecting the unique characteristics of people with darker skin. Other methods, GPS data undercounts people in rural and low income areas. One of the reasons for that is, GPS data can come from a variety of sources, but a lot of it has to do with cell phone pinning. Many times, particularly as researchers, where we get that from is from the larger providers. What happens is in rural America, where you don't have full penetration of cell phone use, of smartphone use in particular, you miss entire groups of people. When you're talking about low income individuals, the monthly plans from which a lot of that information is aggregated, those people aren't using it. They're going to Walmart and doing the pay as you go option, or they're ordering, unlocked phones from Amazon, where the information isn't collected consistently and stored consistently in the same way. So when you rely on that sort of GPS data, or even the mobility data that we were talking about, which is part of that, you're going to miss those segments of people because they don't use smartphones or they don't use them in the same way as much of the population. So for example, the smartphone penetration rate in the United States is about 89%. In the African American community, this is coming from FCC data, by the way, is about 95%. Then when you ask the second question of how much of that is attached to also having high-speed internet or a monthly plan in the household, that number for that population falls back to the 70s. So what that tells us is still a large amount of people from the African American population aren't consistently accessing the capital I internet with a consistent plan, And so the information that we get from our customary sources, our traditional sources, aren't counting them at all or aren't counting them in the same way. The other issue, per what I was talking about, with respect to representation in this larger conversation about the internet sector or the technology sector, is that when we're talking about trust in institutions, which translates into trust in technology, people need to see themselves reflected. Trust Radius did a People of Color Tech report. And what we're seeing is Black, Latin, or Latinx, depending on how you want to say it, and Native American people make up less than 5% of the tech workforce. That's across the board. That's people who are doing coding, that's data scientists, that's GIS positions, that's people in roles like the people you're going to hear from in the Translational Data Institute, in the academic space, as well as in the consulting and even the government space. They look through all of those intersections, and of that entire workforce, those three groups combined make up only 5% of the workforce versus 14%, 20%, and 8% respectively of the general population. So when we talk about what are the factors contributing to this bigger discussion about algorithmic bias or the discussion about collection, having the cultural knowledge and the lived experience to know the nuances of who's using what are not informing the processes by which we go through these things. And so now what's happening is, until we make some corrections, we're doubling down on historical mistrust and historical marginalization that happened in other spaces and bringing it into our work. Now let's talk about bringing this all back to the confluence or the convergence of dealing with disasters and climate change and these groups. Rightfully so, as other sectors are moving into being part of the digital economy and relying more on social media, machine learning, AI, doing big data, or sometimes what I call bespoke data aggregation, is becoming part of agency work. And some of the ones who are doing the most work just happen to be the agencies that typically lead on disaster response or have a role in recovery and planning and mitigation with respect to the episodic disaster events and the larger issue of climate change. And so that's HUD, which is the Housing and Urban Development Agency. And what HUD does is, after there's a large event, they're responsible for doing things like rental payments, temporary housing arrangements. They work with the SBA, a lot of times a Small Business Administration, on whole of community recovery. So housing and small businesses and public infrastructure recovers at the same time, right? High tides lift all boats. And then of course, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is responsible for making sure public infrastructure is restored and also that housing is repaired or that mitigation funding is in place for both individuals and entire communities to recover. What's going on is they are starting to deploy big data analytics. One of the things they're looking at is building code standards. So the information that they collect about entire communities is going to set the code standards for how things are, what the built environment is going to look like after disaster and going into the future as we address climate change. One of these things that's the driving behind that is there are a couple of laws that were passed, but it all comes together as the Enterprise Data Analytics Modernization Initiative. And that's about on the ground issues. So with FEMA, when they do a response, there's a lot of items, a lot of products that need to be in place. Generators, gas, food supplies, clean water in some cases. This Data Analytics Modernization Initiative is using bespoke data to drive how those things are pre-positioned. So let's think this through. If we know that rural and low-income communities are sometimes miscounted or undercounted when we're talking about GPS and mobility data, and we build an initiative centered on pre-positioning much-needed disaster supplies based on that same data, what does that mean for those communities that aren't being counted correctly in the first place? When we think about this in larger terms, We need to think about this in terms of disparities within communities, disparities between states, and then also as we talk about the larger picture of climate change, disparities between countries and between regions. Because some of the anomalies that I pointed out about rural areas have their own nuances within the United States, but it's not unique to the United States. Some of the issues about racial injustice translates into ethnic and religious injustices when we're talking about on a global issue. So the conversation that we're having in the US context today with respect to disasters in the US response to climate change has the potential to expand. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how this works with what we know about Earth observation and other geo-tracking things. But the big challenge is for all of us, as I point out here, still just more than half of the US population doesn't have internet, of the global population does not have internet access. The same thing is true about smartphone penetration. One of the examples, and they're working through correcting this, is that the University of Dundee wanted to use a Twitter mobile app to create an AI-driven flood prediction algorithm. And right now, the last time I checked on it, it's about 70% accuracy. And the reason was the same thing. You're using Twitter, you're hitting certain demographics, certain income levels. If you don't have your app adjusted for both Android and for Apple, then one way or the other, you're going to miss a large chunk of people. Marginalized groups, impoverished groups don't have the same smartphone penetration, or they may not have internet access at all. So if they're in their home, you're not going to get the same data, the same information you're going to get about someone who's using their smartphone at home, or you're not going to get browser data from them because they're not using any of these tools in the same way as a larger population. We saw something similar with flood alerts in Bangladesh, which was resolved by one of the things that I want to talk about as we go into solutions. The adjustment that was made here was actually reaching out and doing deep work in the community and combining the human intelligence with the artificial intelligence. So human intelligence plus artificial intelligence is one way around this. What are some of the other things we can do? If you're in an organization where you're consuming the data, meaning you have reached out to a larger company that specializes in data aggregation or a data broker, I know that's a controversial term at this point, make sure to ask what kinds of tools and what methods the vendor is using. Ask about the data sets and who's included and who's not, or what kinds of factors are included and what's not. And make sure that what you're consuming matches your actual intent. If you are in the role of being a creator or a producer of data and technology new tools, be intentional in your operations. Look at your workforce. Look at your reach. Look at how you're setting up your collection methodology. Look at how you're doing your aggregation and really think through some of the things that we know about how institutional bias translates into collection bias, how algorithmic bias and representation translate into the way that our AI and our machine learning tools function. The way you do that is you overcome it by diversifying. When we're talking about emergency management organizations, one of the things that I advise to them, because this talk I'm giving to you today is based on an article that I've written and that I'm workshopping, that's going to submit it to a journal, but we're going to do some more work on it with respect to other bodies of work on this particular topic, is when we're hiring people from the big tent internet and big tent technology industries, is to get a diverse workforce. Policymakers need to think about data ethics and data transparency when we're having this conversation about should we regulate, big tech. There has been some more nuanced conversation about algorithm regulation, but what I've seen in there are higher level principles, right? Like do no harm and that sort of thing. More nuance. Think about what does it mean to have data ethics? What does transparency mean, particularly with respect to the public? And how can we leverage an ethical and transparent framework to do our collective part towards some restoration of trust in institutions and trust in methodology. And then finally, what I say to everyone is we've started to champion around media literacy because of the conversation about what's going on both in our traditional and our social media. We have long had people championing for economic literacy. Be a champion for data literacy. There's still a lot of people outside of the groups who are doing actual work in academia and actual work in industry who really don't understand what we're talking about when we say data, don't understand how some of these tools work. So if you have an opportunity to give a talk or to reach out and work with community groups, if you're doing translational research, like what we're going to be talking about today, make sure that in your drive to the community, you give them a foundation of learning. It not only helps the immediate work, but you're also doing your part towards moving people towards an equitable participation in some of these programs that we're talking about and larger picture of what does it mean as we drive towards a larger digitally focused society, and to make it so that people can participate, but participate with confidence. They get better outcomes when we start using AI and machine learning to do benefits. We get better outcomes in terms of having a broader group of people to partner with us in research and product development and innovation. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you all and take a look at what we have in chat. Will the presentation be available afterwards? Yes, I will make sure that it's posted. And can I talk about parallels related around the COVID vaccine rollout in marginalized communities? Absolutely. I started, and I'm going to get a sip of tea. So you guys will see me, but I'm just going to reach over and grab it and keep talking, you guys. I mentioned with respect to taking mobility data that we were having trouble recognizing older people and non-white people. Another issue that's happening in that with respect to undercounting is a lot of the signups to receive vaccines is online. You have to go into a database and sign up for it. So this is not even getting to the place of machine learning and AI. This is a connected versus unconnected communities issue. So 58.8% of the world's population has internet, which means just above 40% do not. In the United States, that is very much region specific. So we have high rates in the 80s and 90s of connected communities on the coast, and then that falls into the halfway point and even the 40% and lower point when we get into the middle parts of the country where we have the most amount of rural communities. So the first part of the issue with the COVID-19 rollout is if your sign up is online and you're in places where 40% of your population does not have any kind of internet access and probably aren't using a smartphone, or if they are in a very limited fashion, they're not getting the quickest information about vaccine rollout. Right? They're relying on secondary sources. The other piece of it with respect to machine learning, state by state, and then this breaks down by state income. People are using AI-driven programs and mapping and social vulnerability indicators to try and identify marginalized groups and make decisions about who gets the vaccine, when and where. So all of these issues of undercounting or not counting correctly means that you might correctly identify a Latin or African American community. You may correctly identify which tribal nations need the most vaccine. You may miss people who tend to be essential workers, who don't have consistent living conditions or who have altered their living arrangements because of the pandemic. You will miss people who don't have month-to-month cell phone plans. So again, you put them in the position of relying on secondary or even tertiary information about how to access the vaccine. So unless we really reframe how we're going about this rollout and start using different bases for transmitting the information, there is a risk of undercounting. Now, that said, we're in the midst of a presidential transition. We know that there's a new COVID-19 team that's in place. But I can say anecdotally, this is not official information, about knowing that team, is that there are people on there that understand basic boots on the ground outreach. So in this situation, we're going to have to move away from some of the AI driven tools that we want to use and do some basic outreach, going to churches, going to places where people gather, like the actual Walmart, or to the place you go to get your pay-as-you-go cards to be able to participate. So there's going to be a mix of that with respect to outreach to marginalized communities. But what needs to happen after that is the larger conversation about, as we transfer to more data-driven tools, how are we going to appropriately count those people? In my view, what are the most important steps to mitigate algorithmic bias in AI? More representation. And it's similar to when we have these larger conversations about diversity. You can train people, just like you can train your AI, but actually incorporating the lived experience and the perspective is the best way to get there, because not only do you have a direct impact on the algorithm and the AI and machine learning tools that are developed from it, the people who are working from each other influence one another. So if I'm working in a lab with other people, we're going to exchange our perspectives. So diversifying the workforce and being more intentional about both your research and your innovation workforce, to me, is the best way to go, because you not only get the direct benefit on the technology, but you also get the benefit of the people who are part of that ecosystem. How can data be collected in a way that can be used responsibly to address responses noted by marginalized groups? This is one of these, it's twofold for me. It's about data literacy, because to be honest, most marginalized groups have exposure to data in AI when something has gone wrong, right? It's the mistaken identity because of facial recognition technology. It's unfortunately missing out on funding opportunities to do mitigation or to participate because of something gone wrong. And so for some people in marginalized groups, the bulk of their education has been when something has gone wrong. So the first piece of it is helping people to understand the technology and also to use it responsibly and be transparent. For me, going into a community and I want to do research about mobility data, I make sure that I explain it, but then I also explain how it can benefit the community. Because one of the things that we didn't talk about, and I know I got some questions in Q&A that I'll get to, is the fact that when we talk about FEMA and some of these other agencies, there was a report out that says 25% of FEMA's workforce has experienced some sort of racial or gender-based harassment. So within this agency, you have a very serious bias issue. One of the great things, one of the great potentials about them using machine learning or AI to deliver some of its grant programs, if the collection is done right, and if the workforce that they're using is representative, it will actually override some of those historical internal issues and even the playing field just a little bit for some of the marginalized groups that need that assistance most. Because when we're talking about an agency that size and the timeline of retirement for people and how difficult it is to change out a federal workforce versus how long it will take you to make algorithmic corrections, the opportunity to provide direct benefits for those folks way outweighs any of the problems with the collection methods that I've pointed out here. So it's about showing people good outcomes as well. Okay, let's see what we have in the Q&A. Yes, do we need better theorizing so we understand groups and data interactions? I think for each one of those cases that I put forward, Caroline, we could put together a study. We could do an entire study just about how the Latin population accesses the internet and uses smartphones, and also their perspectives on public institutions, particularly incorporating their lived experience from the last 4 years all the way up through the pandemic, where they're dying at 2.5 times the rate, according to Johns Hopkins research, of the general population. And how are they communicating that? Think about how much more we would learn just about that group. and how much more informed we would be as we go into the process of doing collecting if we had that kind of, if we applied some critical race theory to some of our observations, if we did some interdisciplinary work about collaborative governance regimes and brought that into our study of using AI and directly applicable to FEMA. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. With regards to disaster response tools, our agencies such as FEMA making the AI methods for predicting response open to scrutiny with regards to the possible biases that the tools may have? Yes and no. FEMA and the Small Business Administration have made their data sets public. So you can actually go, and they're not the easiest websites to navigate, but I can actually send the links through so that people who are attending this webinar can go and look at them. They've made their data sets public, so you can go look at the data sets and make some assumptions from that. The Small Business Administration has posted its methodology, so you can actually scrutinize that. Unfortunately, FEMA has not made its methodology for some of the collection public. The statute, the government-wide open data initiative, was passed into law in January of 2019, and implementation through notice and comment rulemaking and all of those things took through the summer. So in all honesty, about 7 or 8 months into it. But I do think that that's a great question or a great petition to make to FEMA, is to open that up. How do we build trust in data and AI-based policy solutions? What needs to happen from the technology and computational side, as well as the societal side? Participatory policy creation, yes, I love that. And evaluation, other. So we've answered that. So a couple of things. I'm glad that you brought up policy. With respect to policy, one of the things where I think we're not going in the right direction is a lot of the focus of policy writers in Congress is on, now they're the big two, social media platforms. Because Google is more than just a social media platform. It's a multi-level enterprise, multinational, multi-level enterprise, and about what they're doing and what they're not doing. And a lot of it is based in antitrust and other line of business activities, as opposed to really looking at what you're talking about, the methods, how the information is used, how it's being sold, how it's being brokered, what outreach looks like. A lot of it is about content moderation and not actually the more discrete understanding of internet infrastructure. All of the underlying data and information and AI that go into running these platforms and are part of the content being distributed is not part of the analysis. So when I say be a champion for data literacy, what I would really like is for our policy writers to champion internally to be data literate and to understand that. Absolutely, it should be participatory. We should, when you're staying with the hypothetical of writing policy, you have the opportunity to really work with the community. I know as a former Hill staffer, and hear their concerns, but also do simple things like town halls to understand their level of understanding. And so that you're actually writing to the community's needs as well as the industry needs, and most assuredly not to your own lack of knowledge about the situation. From the perspective of a researcher, I'm really pleased to see, some of the large grantors like the National Science Foundation want to flip things around and do these innovation grants and these other things that force us as researchers to really participate and to treat people in the community as co-equals in the process. That's one of the ways I think there's a double benefit to that. There's restoring trust in the institution, in the academic institution, but also restoring trust in the technology. I have the privilege of being involved in a project in Baltimore, which started off about connecting some deep urban communities that had no internet access whatsoever. And there's a myriad of reasons for it. But if you've seen The Wire, you know this neighborhood. The capital I internet never came to the neighborhood because of policing issues. The sentiment was that they were having a difficult time controlling certain types of illicit activities with regular cell phones. So if it were fully digitally incorporated, that would make law enforcement's job harder. So this community is not connected. Some years removed, we got to go in and create a community Wi-Fi network. One of the awesome benefits of that is community centers that were training youth, people who were dealing with returned citizens, senior citizens who actually had a lot of knowledge. We were fortunate to get some people that had been involved in tech industry, but had just retired. And that was their neighborhood, and they came back to the neighborhood to do some good things. All became our workforce. So it advanced from connecting a community to now doing things like creating apps and doing other things and wanting to collect that data to do some understanding of what their future economic viability could be. So having the community participate has brought dividends with respect to trust and expanding our own knowledge base about how to co-create with the community in ways that we won't be able to account for a couple of years at least. But we've gone from not connected, no trust, definitely not doing any collection, to the community actually controlling what they wanted to collect and what the uses they wanted to be for that data. So definitely participation. And also the other big takeaway from that hypothetical that I just gave you is agency in marginalized communities. A lot of times across the board, irrespective of the discussion, we would like to deliver things to communities. We would like to have communities vet our assumptions as opposed to understanding the capacity and the agency and the power that's already in a community and allowing that to challenge our assumptions. So a lot of this is about reframing where the agency lies and using that in our work. Yes, and if anyone would like to ask their question live, I'm open to that. And I see we have all of them in the chat. I think I've got everyone in Q&A.
I think, Monica, there is one that came to us as part of the process through which the registration process was. So there was a question from Monique Head from University of Delaware, where she asks, how can data be collected in a way that can be used responsibly to address responses noted by marginalized groups?
Yeah, and so that's a great question. How do we collect it differently? A lot of times it's without any knowledge or permission. So we have instances across the board in the law enforcement community, in academic institutions, as well as in for commercial uses where people are not aware at all of the fact that their information is being collected or that data about their larger community or their demographic group is being collected at all. And so that only adds to the mistrust and the mystery, right? We are questioning because of our collective lived experiences with Henrietta Lacks. Are we the digital Henrietta Lacks of the world is what's happening, to be honest. You know, I'm Afro-Latin. So when I talk about, you know, the Black and the Latin communities, I'm speaking from, you know, my own lived experience and the anecdotes of people in my family, in my community, asking these questions. So a big piece about this, before you even get into the methods, is about transparency, both about the fact that it's happening and how, and what the uses are going to be. The other piece of how you collect it is making the use case to the community. If I am from FEMA and I want to use this information to improve my pre-disaster hazard mitigation grants, which is, you know, doing things like, if you know you're in a flood-prone community, understanding whether you have residences or small businesses, single-family households, elderly people in caring centers in the flood zone, like how and where do we build our mitigation infrastructure? How do we alter the built environment? I need this data to understand how to do that. Having the community understand that it's happening and even bringing them into the process of collecting it seems tedious on the front end, but it is one of the ways to get information from marginalized communities where you have worked to restore trust with a few small wins, right, with respect to transparency and use cases, but also brought their own agency and capacity into the process. And it's a lot of long, deep work in marginalized communities because the issues surrounding the mistrust are so old. So another piece of that on our collective part is understanding that there is a long timeline for some of this. and doing our own planning around that timeline. So yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, another piece of this when we're talking about communities and agency and workforce is we may not be the creators of these programs, but understanding how many programs there are out there that are offering up solutions to some of these problems. Because I've been speaking about institutions, but not necessarily community groups or private organizations, because I think we've all heard of like the Girls Coding Initiative, Black Girls Code. We now have got like Data for Black Lives. We have got a GIS group that is mostly Latin people that are using GIS information, figuring out different ways to diversify the workforce, but also to reach their own people. So now you have a group of folks, it's a small group, but you have a crop of people who are from these marginalized communities that are trained and know how to make the adjustments that we're talking about, both because they have the educational background, but the lived experience. So there is a part of this where, as we're having this conversation, to also watch the kinds of things that are bubbling up from the ground that are also important voices to have in this conversation. But from a pragmatist point of view, if you're an agency trying to manage this, that's also your workforce and consulting population that you can look at. Do you have any specific success stories about data being used responsibly and effectively in marginalized communities? Yes, and one of the stories that I like the best is something that we're probably all familiar with. If you've ever, wanted to practice a language and you want to do it fast and easy and free, you probably have heard of the Duolingo app, right? Duolingo has had a lot of success in preserving dying languages, and that is because of working with mainly indigenous Hawaiian and indigenous Navajo communities on not only collecting the actual language, but collecting information about those communities and getting all of that data and training the AI to train other people how to speak those languages. So because of responsible community work and responsible data collection and AI training, you can now use that app to learn indigenous languages that you never would have had access to. And those people have the pride of authorship over that, right? So that's one great use case. Another one that we think about in the medical community, because a lot of times when we talk about big data AI in marginalized communities, and we bring in the issue of healthcare, then we bring in the Henrietta Lack story or the Tuskegee experience or some of these other things. Look, I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I talked about all the different ways that we got collection wrong with respect to marginalized groups, but with respect to identifying the prioritizing of populations and identifying who needed to come first, using a mix of census data, bringing in historical data from the census all the way up to when the collection ended last year because of the pandemic, combined with mapping technology and combined with what we know about mobility data, we were able to supplement those gaps in the mobility data about marginalized groups to be able to understand that elderly people in nursing homes needed to be in the first wave, but the healthcare workers who were doing it were also disproportionate Black and Latin women, disproportionately single heads of households. So we knew if these women got sick, not only were we pushing infections through the larger population, but we're going to have real impact on families. The entire makeups, which we don't know entirely, but we knew that they would have a detrimental impact, an even deeper impact on that community. So using those layers, bringing together one type of data with historical information and another tool, we're able to isolate and get those workers on the roster to be prioritized for the vaccine. So that's one way of not just the collection and getting the algorithm right and getting the tool right, but also understanding how to supplement it. We're able to get the right groups in line to be able to have them access the information, have them get in line for their vaccines. The shortages, of course, is another challenge, but as we get the distribution correct, this is one state at least, and there may be others out there. I know this because this is where I live and I've been involved in that. We're using it correctly. actually is going to directly benefit a subgroup of people that have it not been done that way, we might have missed that as a factor in dealing with marginalization. And the other piece of it is that in the notices that were sent out, it was really transparent about why. Because not only do you want this subgroup in two marginalized communities to be prioritized in healthcare, you also want to get some small wins in there in terms of trusting this process. Because with respect to the example of COVID-19, with respect to the example of using an app which we attach to the larger conversation about social media, most of the narrative has been really negative and it's been exclusive. So when you bring in trust and inclusivity into the situation, you do have great opportunities to get some really good wins. How can algorithms be used to give more voice to the underprivileged and the marginalized? I think it goes to what I was saying about grooming the bench, is that the algorithm itself is going to reflect the writer, the designer. So you want the underprivileged and the marginalized, as we used them broadly. We want to push that workforce from 5% upwards so that you have more people doing it. Now, while we're waiting for that to happen, what do? It is about what I was saying about being a champion for data literacy. Take the use case from the project that we're talking about in Baltimore. The young people there now have a voice in how the data in their community is being collected and used because they are co-equals in the project. And that doesn't just have to happen with research. If you're doing UI or product development, actually work with people from the groups that you want to reach. They may not have the same training, but understanding how to be translational in its purest form is how to take those lived experiences and combine it with your training to get an outcome. That's how you get a voice. And then also with respect to how we're writing and drafting the policy, I did another event with younger people that was just about how to make your voice heard in public spaces. And I talked about everything from, particularly now that we're in a digital space, taking advantage of these town halls. So when you see Google, I see a ton of AWS webinars on this Amazon Web Services. It does a lot of cloud computing and cloud storage and those kinds of things. Push that information out to those communities. I encourage people from marginalized groups. Your congressman may want to do everything digitally, but they still have to come home to the local office. Actually go there, call there, write a letter if you're unconnected and this reaches you in some kind of way, because it is someone's job to take all that information and give it to the member. So all of these are different ways that voices can be heard, but from our perspective, the best way to do it is through workforce and outreach. And it really is just that simple to do. It's just a matter of overcoming our perceptions of challenges to communication and our own internal biases about where research and product development and design is done, and to be open to doing it in different spaces with different kinds of people.
So with respect to challenges in communication, one of the aspects that we've heard from several of our efforts looking at some of these problems is communicating risk to these communities as well. In fact, that was one of the discussions we had at that event in South Carolina where we were chatting about these things. Can you talk a little bit about, the challenges with communicating risk to some of these marginalized communities, especially in the face of, say, a hurricane or a similar type of disaster that might be hitting?
Yeah, so with respect to risk communication, thank you for that, because this, again, it crosses all lines. Is that when we're talking about marginalized communities, it's normally either mistrust or people have become so accustomed to being marginalized and not receiving assistance is they don't even perceive the risk. So a big part of risk communication is understanding how and whether people perceive risk. And so an example, that same community where I work in is extremely flood prone. We don't think of Baltimore as a coastal city, and the people there are so accustomed to not receiving any kind of assistance that they've just adapted. Like certain parts of the year, everybody just wears closed-toe shoes or boots because they've grown accustomed to walking through the floodwaters. Like they don't associate that with flooding. That's just one of a myriad of things that happens in their community that they don't associate with disasters or hurricanes or climate change or injustice. It's so embedded in them to accept that that's just another layer. So when you have a conversation about flood risk, you have to help them perceive that there's a risk there in the first place. So that's one piece of it, is risk perception. And you'll find this in coastal marginalized communities. Other times, people perceive the risk, but they're doing a cost benefit analysis, because in risk communication and you're trying to do outreach, it's mistrust in institutions or not wanting to access public institutions for a variety of reasons. So in the Latin population, you may have people of different immigration statuses, or because of the way that public discourse has been the last couple of years, just a generalized aversion to accessing public spaces. It's really difficult to reach out to that community when all of the other kinds of communication, whether about risk or about perception of that community or anything else, creates a psychological fissure in between what you're trying to communicate to them and how they perceive the method of communication. So it's about risk communication, it's about method and mistrust. And then also, some of it is just general education. In poor communities, that's just not the focus. So they may be aware that things around them are changing. They may be aware that, they're storm prone or they're disaster prone, but they don't actually categorize it as a risk or something that they need to prepare for. And so helping people understand how to prepare and breaking down some of the barriers. When we were having a conversation about National Preparedness Month, we made a concerted effort to create affordable go kits because that was a barrier to people preparing. And we weren't communicating, speaking of risk communication, we weren't communicating the risk, but we also weren't communicating how to mitigate the risk and how to make that mitigation accessible to people. So what I encountered in working on this project is for people who were connected, the whole conversation about that was coming through celebrities. So it seemed like it was not accessible to them. When we reframed it and went to a CVS and made a $50 preparedness kit, that changed the conversation. And so doing that opened the door for us to not just talk about preparedness and that kind of risk, but to also have some conversations about what climate change means for you if you're poor. And knowing that all these conversations about adaptation and manage retreat and these things are expensive. So what do you do if you're in a low income area and how do you mitigate that risk? So it's a lot of thinking about, is it perceived in the first place? Are there external barriers to the communication period? Not even understanding the risk, and also educating people and helping them understand what's accessible and what's not, so that you have a way to begin talking about risk. So again, it's long, deep work, because one of the struggles is that whatever your entry point is, wherever you're coming from, your vantage point professionally or personally, the structure when we're talking about the United States is we have centuries of marginalization that's geographically, psychologically, economically embedded in communities. And so you're wrestling with that whenever you're trying to do this kind of community work. And so there's a certain level of patience and historical context that comes into bear, whether you're dealing with technology or if you're just trying to do community preparedness work. So my big takeaway from this is there are ways to mitigate it, but it needs to be contextualized in the narrative of the country. And you'll find if you do global work, you will also be wrestling with history that's much deeper than ours. And that needs to be taken into context when you're working in communities. So yeah, I see we're just at time. So I'm going to thank you all for coming, and then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Srini.
So I think you summarized it beautifully at the end, where you brought up the fact that a lot of these things have to be contextualized. And I think that is a very, very important point that you're making there. Again, on behalf of Ohio State University and the Translational Data Analytics Institute, thank you very much for your time and enlightening thoughts on this particular topic, Professor Sanders. And again, for those who are still with us, if any of these things have triggered sort of things where you would like to have a deeper conversation with Professor Sanders, that can certainly be arranged. We can work through Dev Singer, who's been the primary organizer of this event series. So you can work with her, you can send me an email, and we can try to get that scheduled. And again, once again, Professor Sanders, thank you very much for your time here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.